Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 34, Common Questions in Current Cases. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to the Takeup. It is 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time where I'm at here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but wherever you're at, I'm happy you are joining me for the Takeup. We have some great stuff to talk about today, and certainly some things that should be interesting for everybody who wants to know kind of what I do as I answer questions all week and help embroiderers with what they're having trouble with. So today we have essentially, what did I call it, right? Current cases and frequently asked questions. I'm going to talk about a couple of cases, if you want to call it that, case studies for things that people have been showing me who had questions. We have some things about some skewing, some fill problems, some distortion. We have some issues with some 3D foam that cause somebody problems. I'm not going to show, hopefully, I'm going to try not to show exactly the designs they have. I'm going to show some elements from the designs and hide some things so that I don't want to show their customers' work, but I will show you what I worked on and show you a little bit about what's going on there so that we can talk about these things. Some of these are going to refer back to earlier episodes of the Takeup and other things I've taught, but I still think they're super useful. And honestly, things that we can have discussions about in the comments and together. And after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the most frequently asked questions that I get. What questions do I hear most frequently, and what things am I called upon to answer most frequently? We'll talk a little bit about what they were. I have an article that I wrote a couple of years ago that I think is still interesting, but things have certainly changed, and we'll talk about what they are now. And as part of that, I would love for you to think about what your questions are, what things you would like me to answer, and get into the comments and talk about those things. Let's say, what are the things that you have to ask the most about embroidery and digitizing that you would like answered? And maybe there'll be an episode of the Takeup in the future, or maybe if you ask some questions here, we might answer those live, because I'll tell you what, when I have the chance to do it live, Q&A is one of the best ways to handle questions. I love doing that. If back in the days of the trade shows, I feel like sometimes it was years ago and not recently, we sometimes got to do panels. And though I love teaching, though I love having my slides up and doing the lecturing that I am known for, I really do enjoy doing panels. And if I could do hours of just Q&A and panels, I would love to do that, because it's great to get people together and do that kind of panel work. It's great to do that Q&A and live questioning. So like I said, if you are here, if you're in the comments and you've got questions, please put them up, whether you are on YouTube or on Facebook. While we're live, put them up. Go ahead and put them in the comments after the fact, because people go back and answer them, and I go back and answer them after the fact as well when I go through the comments. So by all means, go ahead, jump in the comments, and let's talk about the different kind of questions we have today. And certainly, let's go over some of these cases that I had to deal with in this last week, things that people asked me about, and what we can learn from those cases. Like I said, we're going to tread over some old ground, but that's why I'm talking about frequently asked questions. Why do we talk about these things? Because they're asked repeatedly, because they come up over and over and over again. And it's worthwhile talking about them and discussing the kinds of settings that we use and the kinds of things we do to remedy the problems. So by all means, let's get into it. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and say some hellos to people who have showed up today. Number one, out of Texas, Cindy King says, good afternoon. Well, good afternoon, Cindy. I am super glad to have you in and have you here. Ramona McKee says, and quite correctly, I would say, wasn't just Friday last week. Yeah, this week really went by quickly, and I can tell there's lots of people who didn't get in on any of the things that I did this week. I know that when I saw people showing up, they're just like, man, is it the day that we're doing this? Is this the thing that we're doing today? Are we doing this? Because everybody is both busy or kind of off of their schedule. So it's been kind of a crazy week lately. And I'll say, yeah, Friday to Friday, Takeup to Takeup. Sometimes that gets pretty short. I find myself in the Brilliant Studios, having often worked in my home office for the week and going, wow, wasn't I just here doing this? Wasn't I just lit up and doing the Takeup? But yeah, it was just Friday. It feels like it. Don Scott Johnson is here. Hey, y'all. Happy to be here today. And best part of Education Friday. Oh, thank you, Don. I love that. That's very nice to say. Love to be part of Education Friday for people. I think this is something cool. I actually discussed this with the guys of Two Regular Guys this morning. If you don't check out the podcast, Two Regular Guys, it's Aaron and Terry, as you know, Aaron Montgomery, Terry Combs, who are excellent experts in their own right, sublimation and screen print if you want to go there, but they know a lot more than that. And honestly, talking to them, we discussed Education Friday. It was really cool to talk about all the different shows that are going on. You have us, you have Marshall and Alan who come on after us. You have tons of people. I also have seen distributors getting into this. definitely companies who are giving materials and talking about machinery, they are getting into Education Friday too. Hey, let's make this happen, guys. Let's make Education Friday a thing overall. Frank Dunn out in the UK. Good evening to Frank. Thank you, Frank, for coming and showing up today. And Justin says, happy Takeup Friday. Justin Armenta, Digitizer. Thank you, man, especially because I got to see some of your stuff. If you guys haven't checked out MNerd, you'll see Justin and Jeff, and they're doing classes and doing lives on Thursday nights. And they've got some great stuff going on, too. So go check out the MNerd group if you haven't checked it out. Hopefully somebody will throw it in the comments. If not, I'll throw it in the comments later, and you'll be able to get a link. But good stuff going on there as well, and it's awesome. Angela White Mitchell, hello, everybody. Hi, Angela. Happy to have you here. And Just Carlson out in Sweden. Hi. I don't know what time it is for you, my man, but sir, happy to have you here. Glad that you find it useful, and thank you for coming in. Jeremy Picker, by the way, if you haven't seen what Jeremy's doing, by the way, we're going to do some collaboration and be talking soon. There's some cool stuff coming up from Jeremy and me. However, if you haven't seen what he's doing, follow this guy's social, Jeremy Picker, Amber Creative, the mood boards, the constant looks at what is current and new, and all of the vision that you see out of Jeremy, incredibly useful. He's been everywhere lately. He's a bit like people say about me. I'm on all the podcasts. I show up everywhere. Jeremy's the same way, and he is really rocking out that content. So keep it up, Jeremy. You're the man. Jeff coming in. Hello, Jeff. Hope you are feeling good and doing well. Check him out. Like I said, check out his lives on MNerd. It's awesome. And MJ Caff right here. Hello from Texas. Thank you for showing up as well. Thank you. And Donna says, I'd love to hear more one day about embroidery on leather. I have an amazing project coming up. Curious about density. I will take that under consideration. I've done some leather work, not a tremendous amount. But yeah, I have done a goodly amount of leather work and have some ideas about that. Maybe we can talk about it. That's, by the way, you wanted to start a fight among embroiderers real quick. Talk about the needle for leather. If you don't know and you're new, people fighting over what needle to use on leather is something I have dealt with many, many times over. My wife and I always joke about the cycle of embroidery education because she's always like, isn't it about time that you taught small lettering again, or are we back around to 3D foam? There's a cycle of things we teach over and over again. And one of them, like I said, one of the arguments that we have over and over is what needle we use on leather. And I'm going to say I don't use a leather wedge needle because it cuts, and sometimes you can cut your thread. But we can talk about that again later. That's more for construction or for big, thick boot leather, but maybe we'll do an episode, huh? Jeremy says, I know it depends on the digitizer, but as a non-embroiderer, I know slow down the project process having to get custom estimate on stitch count every time. I don't have digitizing software, so are there tools to estimate for us creative agencies? This is a hard one. One of the ways people do it is by doing an estimation. And here, since we're doing case studies and questions, I'm just going to get into this briefly because this is going to be fun. One of the ways people do this is by estimating things like satin stitches by the linear inch, and they will do square inches or square centimeters of fill stitches and do estimates that way. Is it a real great estimate? It's okay. You can make that happen, but probably the best estimates I've ever had are from a digitizer. I understand that as a non-embroiderer, non-digitizer, having to reach out to a digitizer to ask us is a little rough, but because we both have the software in hand, and because we usually have experience and can tell you more about stitch counts, that's a good way to get that done. Otherwise, I'll be honest and say that most estimation software I've used, it's okay. A lot of it does people rely on using automatic digitizing software to make estimates, but then those estimates don't really reflect what they're going to do if a digitizer makes selections on it. But you can also look up, I don't have an article with me right now, but there are great articles. And in fact, I believe, speaking of Justin Armenta, he's got an article where he talks about estimation that's pretty good too. So Justin, if you want to check in with Jeremy, he's got an article that talks about using that area to estimate stitches. And it's all right. Like I said, it's all right. It's not bad. I would say that it depends definitely on the digitizer. So if you do that estimation yourself and then you make changes after the fact, you're going to see some discrepancies. But hey, that's something that's to be expected. So there you go with that. Jerry says, hello, Candy Delgado. Happy to have you here. Viewing from Sedona, Arizona. 2 regular guys was great this morning. Yeah, check it out. We had Christine Shreve on, and she was doing the quarterly Women in Garment Decoration thing where we turn over the microphones and the women get on and talk about their experience in garment decoration. They're talking about trying to get more women excited about starting businesses. It's really great. So check out 2regularguys.com. That's the number 2. And check them out for more of that. When that comes up, great episode this morning that Christine hosted. So thank you, Christine, for that. And thank you, Candy. Richard James says, hello. Greg says, hi from Boston. Yep, I see. Thank you for telling me the time there, sir. Mike Muldowney is in. Hey. Happy to see him here. And that's Justin. I believe he is posting. That is the link for the MNerd group. Get out there and check out what they are doing also. Marlena says, I have a hard time doing 3D puff for designs with sharp points such as lightning bolts. Do you find this to be true? The tips always look terrible. You know, it really depends on how you close those off. I actually have done a previous episode on 3D foam that you may want to check out, and I'm going to go ahead and drop this out. What I'll say is some people have bad looking tips on 3D foam thin lines, mostly because they are adding underlay, and the underlay is popping out. A lot of that happens on those thin tips. Tips can look a little rough, but you got to keep your angles very perpendicular. Check out that other episode. And like I said, we're going to cover 3D foam again. That was only a part one of many, because 3D foam is something that always takes more work than you might think. That's something that even I have done tons of sampling. I have a bunch of 3D foam stuff sitting here next to me. And I will say, you know, thin tips can be rough. I'll say that, you know, even on something that's very thick, you'll find that these tips, if you're going to do a what I call a tapered corner there, that taper can look a little rough. You can get a little bit of the thread falling off of it. It depends on how you're doing it. You need to shorten up enough. And I still, even though you don't need a cap on a tapered end, I will still often put a small cutting stitch, what I like to call an arrow or a point, where I will drop a couple little underlay stitches in there and pre-perforate that foam before I pull it off. So even though I don't need a full density cap like you might on an open end, I will still use something to cut that off a little bit before the end of that taper. So that's something we can talk about again later too. So yeah, let's we'll talk about all that. Anyway, we have some other stuff. Here's the guide from Justin Armena. He shows that as well. A guide on stitch count estimating. Go check that out. And yeah, Justin did that video, as Mike is saying here. Did a video on that, exactly as described. The loose estimate are based on square, inches, and linear measurements. It'll get close, but the best is a fast answer for Digitizer, and I would agree on that. Good to have you guys in here. And as you see, I did go ahead and post that up. That is that previous episode on 3D foam from the Takeup. Keith Burwell is in. I hope you're doing well, Keith. Hope you're staying well out there. And we also have Sharon Phillips is in here. We have Joe Rita. Joe Rita's awesome, been doing some great digitizing work, so glad to have her in as well. And here we are. Jeremy says, thanks, Mike. My customers don't get too worked up on price. So for me, a high end of stitch count is good. Absolutely great then. And also, I'll say this. That's where auto might be useful for you, the people who have auto. I don't like auto digitizing for almost anything, but it sure will give you more stitches than you need. So that would give you the high end count. All right, I'll quit ripping on auto digitizing for a minute. Everybody knows that I have my feelings about auto. But in any case, from that, guys, let's go ahead and actually get into the meat of the show. I'm going to try and hopefully keep the show a little shorter today. We'll see how that goes. I don't know that we want to do another 1.5 hour epic, but let's go ahead and get into the actual topics that we wanted to start with. And today, I wanted to do cases. Remember, I said we have a couple of current cases, things I want to discuss. And so these are actually a couple of things that were asked to me directly from my social media, from my email. I have my email out there in the open. If you haven't seen it, embroideryerich@gmail.com, and that's ERICH, or as Terry Combs from Tubular Guys is often want to put it, Erich, which I don't love, but hey, I like him. But embroideryerich@gmail.com is my kind of general catch-all email for that stuff. I get questions all the time, and I often stop and answer them. I'm not always fast, but I do try and answer whatever I can, especially if I've got people from my crew here, people who go to my seminars, come and see me, read my articles, who are here at the Takeup. You guys get priority when I answer questions like this, but I try and answer for everybody I can because I just want to lift this industry up. Anyway, we had a couple of cases this week that were actually interesting, and in fact, I've given them goofy little names, and I think it should be fun to handle. So let's start off with the first case, and I'm going to call it the case of the scary skew. Now, what are we talking about here? Skew. We all know if we use graphic software, skew is when something tilts off to one side, right? We're trying to do that. We're trying to manually do that. We want something to skew. That's one thing. The problem is that I had a nice decorator. Like I said, not going to name names because I didn't ask if people wanted their names named. I do tell people that I usually talk about these things on my shows, but this decorator came to me and saying, every time I run this one fill heavy design, it skews off. It looks more like a rhombus than a rectangle. Everything skews off to one corner to one side. And for me, I didn't even have to look. I did ask for the file. I said, go ahead and send me the file. I'll take a look at it. No problem. However, I didn't even have to look for this to be a thing. I knew immediately what they were talking about when they're talking about skewing like this. And especially the funny thing is I love when somebody says rhombus because that's what I always explain. I'm like, yeah, if your square is a rhombus, I know what's happening to you. So why don't we discuss this, folks? Why don't we see what we're talking about when we talk about this scary skew, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pop up my screen here so you can see it. And this is the original file. Now I have taken off, I've hidden some text that was on this file. So no, this is not the entirety of the file. There was some nice lettering here that it had a shadow on it and an outline, and it was all done in satin stitches. And it's something that, you know, pretty standard piece, right? Pretty standard piece, not too difficult, not too strange. However, every time he used this piece, he was finding that there was skewing, it was tilting off. And I'm going to tell you this, right now, I'm going to bet that some of you out here in the audience, and I'm going to go, I actually have a pointer focus here now so you can see my pointer for once. Hopefully that'll help us to see what I'm pointing at. I'm going to bet you guys in the audience, now that I zoom in on this, you probably already know what direction this thing is tilting, don't you? Right? Anybody who's been here long enough will know, we know what pull and push distortion is, right? We know that toward the opens and ends of stitches, or toward the edge of a stitch, whether it's a satin stitch or a fill stitch, we're going to get push distortion that goes out toward these open sides. And I believe I can draw on this as well now that I've got pointer focus here. Let's go ahead and see what we can do. Let's get some arrows here. We know that we've got this stitch angle, right? Well, what are we trying to do with this stitch angle? We know that we've got pull and we've got push. Push is going to push out toward the open ends. And by the way, Jeff Fuller says, yay, pointer focus. And I'm going to say, yeah, man, yay, pointer focus. I agree. It is you who turned me on to using this particular one. I've been looking for something. But here's what we're looking at. We see with this stitch angle, we're going to look at this central fill first. Number one, that's a pretty severe angle, right? But what are we going to see? All right, toward these ends, which I'm going to call the open ends, the side of the stitch. If there's a stitch from point 1 to point 2, the side of the thread, not the ends of that stitch. Toward that open end, we're going to have push distortion, right? Here's what we have. There's our push distortion right there. We know that we're going to have push distortion in that direction. What do we also know? That in the direction of the stitch angle, we're going to pull. The stitches are going to pull tighter. They're going to cinch in. They're going to get a little bit smaller. So what are we going to have here? In this direction, we're going to have pull. And what you're also going to see is look at those pieces up at the top. Now we've got all of this fill here, all of this fill here. What do we have on this secondary fill? The fills at the top and bottom? Well, here's our open ends this direction. All right, and we had this direction over here for the central fill. And then we have our pull here again, about this direction. The angles are different, but they're pretty darn similar, aren't they? So now here's all of this going on. Here are all these things pushing and pulling, and they're all pushing and pulling in the same directions. So we have everything pushing off to this corner. And for you guys, it'll be like this. My camera's reversed, I always forget. So we're pushing off to this corner, pushing out to that corner, and we're pulling in on these other sides, right? We're pulling in. So that means we're going to pull in on these sides, and we're going to push out those other sides. Obviously, what we're going to get is tweaking. It's going to lean over, and it's going to lean over in this direction because it's going to pull in and push out. We're going to lean in that opposite direction. So it's going to lean over and push out, and it's going to become oblong and weird. Now, the thing is, it's not that we get this incredible skew all the time, but why is it the worst here? Why are we getting the worst kind of skew here in comparison maybe to another file? Or maybe why would it change if we had the stitch angles different? Maybe we're still going to get skew of some kind. How can we avoid the skew being quite this bad? Why does it look so bad in this piece? Well, it's not just the pull and push distortion. It's the fact that when we're looking at a garment, the garment has a weak grain. And I know if you've been in any of my classes, you know this already. You've heard me talk about it. And I'm actually going to go ahead and go large screen here if I can and make this happen. Let's go ahead and see if I can put myself back up on full screen. And we'll talk about this. There's a weak grain in the garment, right? And I have a piece here. Now, this is just a piece. This is a sample, so it's got an eagle on it. It's got some stuff on it. But this is a piece of very normal woven material, right? This is woven material, something you would usually consider to be pretty stable. It doesn't have a lot of stretch. But here's the thing. In the way that it is on a person, the way that it's riding on a person, this is the vertical grain of this fabric. When we pull on the sides, you don't see a lot of pull. I mean, you see where my fingers are pulling it, but my hands are not coming apart very much. My fingers are not coming apart very much at all, even though this has a little bit of stretch and it's a thin piece of material. When I pull on the top to bottom vertically, is there some stretch? Yes, but not much. It's arresting that pretty well. If I grab this thing and I pull on a 45-degree angle, you already see it. You can look at how much stretch and rebound I'm getting on that 45. The structure of that woven material allows it to stretch on that bias on that 45-degree angle. And what do we have again? What do we have when we're looking at this thing? When we're looking at this particular piece? Well, we're not quite on the 45, but we are darn close. Between these two angles is 45 degrees. If I go over here, and I'll grab my pointer focus and turn that on again. If I go over here and grab a ruler tool, I can jump on this thing and I can measure and say, okay, we're at like 126. That's pretty tight. I mean, it's almost like what we would expect. We have our 45, 135, or our two angles that are 45 degrees, off of horizontal or vertical. Well, there we are, 127. That's pretty steep. And then even this piece, all right, it's not super steep, but we're looking at about 34, 35 degrees. So we've got these really steep angles. And if that weren't enough, we're going to look at this piece again. I'll go ahead and let's go ahead and see if we can see all of it. And we're going to go ahead and run it through our stitch simulator. We're going to go ahead and run this piece. Number one, we've got some really kind of the underlay is not really running in a direction that's going to stabilize it all that much. It's running really not very perpendicular to this top stitching. I like a more perpendicular underlay. It's not a lot of underlay here anyway. But in this original piece, well, what do we have? We've got this thing. It runs down to this corner, jumps over here, and then runs back up to this corner. So also it's trapped that center. That center area is trapped. I would probably invert this thing and run the center first and run it kind of center out. If I was running on light materials that are having trouble, I would use what I always call the tablecloth method. Start from the center and move out so that you push any wrinkles toward the outside edge. You don't trap any material before you run on it. But then once again, we're running same directions back down to that bottom corner. We haven't really tried to oppose these very much. And the other thing you're going to see is if we look really closely, if we look at the specifically down at this interface here, yes, they are not on the same angle, these two fills, but they're on a similar angle. So we're probably going to get some roughness. We're going to get a little bit of fall through, some show through in that angle there where these two fills jump on top of each other. Now, I went ahead and showed this person a sample with replaced fills. Now, I didn't get to replace everything. I didn't get to do all the work I would do if I was doing this from scratch, and I didn't change the sequence. Not very much. I would have probably, if this were my piece entirely to do, I'm going to say I may have done the center first and not worried too much about the layering in this particular piece because it's graphical and it doesn't need to be necessarily that one thing is on top of the other to show any sort of dimension. I might have changed that and I might have changed the sequence. We'll go ahead and run through it again. But you can see that the stresses that are on this piece very much go in one direction primarily. So that's what we have going on there. I'll go ahead and show you the piece that then I replaced this with. And you can see that I've just used a much less steep angle. So this one is about 15 degrees. This is a 15-degree angle. Do we still have some push? Yes, but the push is largely what? Vertical. The push is vertical. The pull is largely horizontal. We're just going to get less distortion. And so what we have in this particular piece, I actually think it's a little steep. I could go even a little less steep than this and be all right. I think you see a little bit of roughness, a little jaggedness here that probably won't actually show in the final piece. But I really like it. 15 degrees is really nice. It's not a bad setup here. And I like to use 15. I think you could have gone down to 12 and been pretty safe. I will say this, that if you go too much further than this, and I'd say even here, I can see why people want to go steeper to get a cleaner edge here. I would also be very tempted to put a light density satin stitch right up to the edge on this and put an edge in here because I like to have a little satin stitch border in there. I know it adds a little texture that's not in the original design. I think it looks nice. It looks like some embossing. Not everybody likes that, but you can do it. This piece, though, you might see a little bit of roughness here, but I don't think that it's outwardly too terrible. And I think when you actually ran it, you would see a ton of it as well. I didn't change how much overlap there is. I think there's probably a little too much overlap in here between these two fills, but it's not terrible. What I will say, though, is that this is a much less stressful angle on the material. So if this was what I would be doing, and like I said, I didn't change the sequence very much at all. I left it in the same sequence with the center running second, but you will see that that's just it's a less stressful angle. And also that though I've got 15 degrees off of the horizontal, I've actually opposed those angles. Yes, these are both 15 degrees off the horizontal, but then this body is 15 degrees the other direction. Being that I can now kind of stretch these in two different directions. Now I'm looking at this too. I could have also opted not to run these both vertically. Like I said, didn't have time to change everything. I mostly just changed the stitch angle on it before I ran. But you could also oppose these and not run both toward the top. Looking at it again, it's something that I should have done and didn't do. But like I said, this was me just showing somebody what kind of angles should they use if they were trying to do this in a less stressful way. Also, you can see that I've used slightly more underlay, mostly just kept it where it is perpendicular to the top stitching. I think perpendicular to top stitching is going to be more likely that the stitches land on multiple rails of underlay. We want each stitch to land on at least two lines of underlay to keep it up off of the base. And then we can probably lighten the density a little bit, something else that I didn't have a chance to do. Also, I didn't know, with the small amount of time I had to work on this, didn't know what color they were going on, so I couldn't mess with the densities very much. However, I do think that I would like to run this certainly more in the horizontal method. People will also say, okay, you just showed us that the vertical fill, or the vertical angle rather, isn't as stressful either. And I would say, yes, no, the vertical angle isn't as stressful. However, if this design ever runs on something knit, there's a high chance that with a knit, the knits stretch horizontally quite a bit. You can imagine it's like a tube, a knit tube. Those ribs that are in, say, even a jersey knit, even something fairly low texture, like a t-shirt or a heavy t-shirt, still going to stretch in that horizontal very easily. And you're going to have grain, so that if your top stitching runs dead vertical, absolutely 90 degrees vertical, you'll have grain where it falls in and out of the ribs in knits. And if I don't know what this is going on, if I have to treat this like a digitizer who's going to hand this off and realize that my embroiderer may use this on any number of things, I'm going to definitely look at not doing a vertical angle, because that vertical is likely to fall in and cause me problems. So that was the first case. That's the Skew. I'm going to go ahead and check out. We've got a couple more people asking questions. We have Cindy saying, so could you run the middle fill first straight up and down and then work with the ends as is? Like I said, I wouldn't run the middle fill straight up and down. No. The other thing that you're going to see on this as well, we have text. I don't want to show you the text because the text is from someone else, but you can imagine with text, you're going to have a lot of satin stitches that are vertical, so that their edges are vertical. What's going to happen if you have vertical fills, exactly vertical, and you run those satin stitches on top? It's the same thing as when you run a completely horizontal fill and then run a box of outlining and satin stitch around it. You'll see that the fill stitches get pulled apart by the border at the top and the bottom, and that's why people often want to run those 45-degree angles. That's one of those things that you might not want to have, because then your lettering is going to interact poorly. Stuff that's on top of this fill will interact poorly with the fill. Why? Letters, by and large, have vertical spines on them and horizontal lines as well. You have vertical and horizontal lines. When you have that, you're going to end up interacting poorly with that background and pull them apart. So yeah, and no problem with that. Cindy says, I forgot you said there's text. Yeah, there's text on top of it. Like I said, I don't want to show the text because it's not my design to show, but it is something to think about. You have to think about the interaction not only with the fabric beneath, but you need to think about the interaction with all of the layers on top. So that's one of those things we can talk about. And Cindy also says, would a woven backing or stabilizer have helped in the original? If they were not stabilizing correctly, it certainly would have hurt the design. The honest answer is that they had stabilizer that I thought was good. They were using a solid cutaway stabilizer that I think should have been enough to hold up. The problem is that it was still skewing despite that. And I'm going to say, if you're stabilized correctly, if your hoop tension is right, so you're not having, it's not sliding or slipping out of the hoop, then really that's probably not the thing that's causing the most trouble here. As long as you've got a nice firm hooping and you're not overstretching, so it's not rebounding or doing anything weird there, because that might show, it wouldn't show any distortion like we're talking about, but it would show, puckering, rippling, and all that mess. Then it should be fine. You shouldn't have to go that way. And I don't know if adding a woven would have changed it. Like I said, if the stabilization wasn't enough, yeah, you can throw more stabilizer. And I've said this a lot of the time. You can come at this from multiple directions. It just depends on where you want to end up. Can you stabilize a design by throwing heavier stabilizer, more stable stabilizer at it until it stabilizes? Yes. People often do. And yet, Cindy, you're totally right. Just when you hit all the bases, absolutely. Holistic attitude. I can tell you've been watching Education Fridays. You want a holistic attitude toward it. So when you're thinking about any design and trying to do this, in fact, there's a diagnosing designs take-up a couple back that you might want to check out. You want to think about, is your stabilizer the correct kind of stabilizer that you need? Is it enough stabilizer? Are you using it correctly? Do you need some sort of adhesion if the fabric is sliding around? Do you need something to stick the stabilizer down? Is your hoop tension right? Is it sliding around in the hoop, or is it firmly hooped? There are things like that that should all be said and done before you worry about the file, or at least the file can't help but have problems if you set it up that way. Now, you can distort the file. You could totally change the shapes in the file. And if you change the shapes in the file, you could distort the file and make it work. But you're going to have a twisted up, messed up look on the design anyway, or you're going to have weird distortion or ripples or something else if it's pulling it all out of shape. Can you do that? Sure. Can you lighten up densities and stuff until it just doesn't distort as much? Yes, but you're going to have a lot of show through. Can you throw more stabilizer until it works? Yes, but then you're going to have thick stabilizer in the back, and then the garment might not wear as nicely, be as nice to wear or to have on. It might not have the nice hand that you want. So those are the things you have to look at. If we want the most balance, then what we want to do is have just enough stabilizer, just the right number of stitches for coverage, just the amount of tension we need in the hoop to keep it nice and firm so we're not stretched out of proportion, we're not doing anything crazy there. And that holistic attitude of getting everything right means that things run well and have a nice hand and drape well on the body, aren't bulletproof, don't feel like a plastic credit card, don't feel like a piece of cardboard. Those things are what we're looking for. And so Cindy, I agree with you entirely. Perfection is her end goal. I only ever use one piece of stabilizer. Yeah. Are there reasons to use more than one? Yes, but I really try to keep it down to one piece of the right kind of stabilizer everywhere I can. Whenever I see somebody stacking up 4 pieces of stabilizer, I usually think, okay, you must have a problem in your hoop, a problem in your design, a problem somewhere else, because you are compensating. Can we compensate? Yes, we can compensate. Should we compensate? Probably not. Now, don't get me wrong. I've digitized for a lot of wacky machines and setups, and I've done some stuff in my career that I wouldn't suggest you do. I've certainly digitized around a machine that wasn't operating correctly. I have done that. Can you compensate? Yes. Should you compensate? Probably not. You should have your machine in working order, and you should have the right amount of stabilizer when you work. So let's go with that. That's the first case. If you guys want to talk about that again, we can. But I'm going to go ahead and show you very briefly as well. I'm going to bring this up on screen. This is a slide you've seen before. This is me calling myself out. When I was very young in my career, I actually did a piece that looked really terrible. And this is the same kind of shape distortion that we're seeing. It was on a nice PK Polo. And I've got this old Swatch here. And what I'd like to point out, especially because I have pointer focus now, thank you, Jeff. This is one of those things here. It was pushing out so hard at that 45 that we were getting a little bit of the fill coming out here. This is not a trim that's not working. This is the fill absolutely popping out, going in this direction and coming out that way. And what I'll also say is Frank said he likes 30 and 15 degrees. 30 degrees is pretty good. I've used it. It can be kind of steep depending on the material. But 30 is fine. 45 is just a little much. I don't like 45. 30 can work. And if you're on stable stuff, it's better. I like going down to 15 when I'm on something very unstable and I'm having issues with stretch. And Jeff says he likes 32. So yeah, hey guys, try it out. Try 30 degrees. Try 30, try 25, try 20, try 15. That's the real angle. Go ahead and run through the different angles and see what it does for you. Do a nice 1-inch square block and run all of those, and that's a pretty good idea. And say, anyway, let's go ahead and say this too. We got a couple more things. We've got Frank says he uses 2 pieces of 40-gram stabilizers. There's some stabilizer recommendations. And Mike says this. He's got 2 layers of action back for performance wear, maybe. Anything more is craft level, no good for production. On the other hand, sometimes got to do what you got to do and charge the customer accordingly. Yeah, no doubt. And like I said, some of that compensation can be good. There are times when the compensation is good. One of those times is when you can use a temporary stabilizer and hold things together while we do it. And yeah, Jeff, most definitely, Jeff is absolutely correct. You should have a swatch with all the different fill angles. Absolutely. And when any new material you run, take that same design that has a bunch of fill angles every 5 degrees or so in a little square and run it in combination with a couple different kinds of stabilizers you use the most. And then you will know what the stitch angles do, what that does with the stabilizer, and how that works with the particular material you're working on. Testing swatches are critical. So yes, thank you, Jeff. But go back to Mike for a second. Sometimes you do what you have to do, and some compensation can be okay. Like I said, one of the things I've done is use temporary water-soluble stabilizers. It does make the stitches a little looser, but I have used water-soluble stabilizers to stabilize things that cannot have stabilizer showing later, but also can't hold up during the process. I have done that. It's something you can do. I've done, I did some heirloom handkerchiefs that really could not have much on them. So it was light densities, very careful work in the digitizing and the embroidery, water-soluble, heavier water-soluble stabilizer, and realizing that there's going to be some looseness, so I was careful with my tension. So those are times you can do that. And I've also seen people do, I cannot remember who did this. I would love to show you guys the video, something that Printware did a while back when they were doing show floor work. There was a guy who had a laser bridge machine, and he did an applique jersey on jersey. So we're talking about t-shirt weight jersey knit, and he actually did a light applique, 0 stabilizer. But the thing is, it was only a single run of straight stitch that was holding this thing down. We had a laser bridge come down and do the cutting, and you could carefully remove that top layer. So when you're doing that, yes, can you do that? Yes. Could you then put this design I just showed you, or this design you're looking at now, on that same setup? Absolutely not. It wouldn't hold up because there's no stability. It's about knowing your material, how it's going to react, your design, what it contributes to that distortion, and what you can do to balance all those things. So absolutely that's the case. So I would say, check the swatches, check all the different fill angles, try things out, and do this with whatever software you're using, with whatever materials you're using, with whatever new material, new garment comes into your shop, because those swatches are gold when you need to refer to them again. And like I said, this is very early on in my career. It's on a piece of pretty standard, bog standard cotton piqué polo. But as you can see, absolutely a rhombus. We've got angle problems here. And since I didn't have pointer focus, when you can't use that when you're doing your slides, I have a slightly different look to this piece. This is what I end up showing people. I lower this down to like 15 degrees. Like I said, everybody's saying they like to use 30. 30 will probably show a little less splitting at the top and bottom. Really depends on how stretchy your material is. I like to use a pretty shallow angle, and I just ramp it up as I have to get the look I want to. I would say I do often end up a little bit steeper than 15, but I also have done some pretty low stuff as well, because the other thing I will do is put a light jaggedness, a light feathering on the inside of certain columns. We'll have, like, let's say I have a satin stitch border on something. A little bit of light feathering will mean that though I have stitches coming up at a shallow angle, sometimes I grab one, sometimes I grab two, and it's on such a micro scale that you don't necessarily see the roughness. So you can, like I said, you can compensate for things multiple ways. When you have a border, a satin border running over fill, certainly the angle of the fill is one big way to compensate for that splitting. Another way is to break up the edge of the satin stitch. So let's go there. This is the thing I like to show you, everybody, though, is that yes, everybody makes mistakes, and I learned by destroying polo shirts. This thing was supposed to be a square, and very much wasn't a square when I was done, because what do we have here? That's our angle of pull. That's our angle of push distortion. So definitely something to check out and something to think about, guys. Let's go ahead and go to our second case real quick. And this one is actually a 3D foam case. So let's go ahead and drop out my screen for a second. Or I'll drop myself out, one or the other. All right, folks. Yeah, pointer focus makes my pointer act a little funny between my two screens. I'm running on two screens left and right here, so it may be a little strange. Suffice it to say, however, we also had one more case that came in this week that shouldn't be a really long one to talk about, but it is something that's interesting that I'd like to discuss with you guys. And the second case I'm going to call the case of the Killer 4. Now, this is because the person who sent it to me told me that they had a Killer 4 in their design. And you're going to say, all right, a Killer 4? And I'd say yes. They were doing numbers on top of a filled design. Now, I'm not going to show you the fill that was underneath it. Doing 3D foam numbers on top of a fully filled design. So there's a fully filled design on the cap. Can't quite avoid being on top of some fill. I don't think that was the problem, though, but there was an issue. They're saying, is there too much density? What's going on? I'm having a ton of breakage and issues, and things are kind of bunging up in the same spot over and over. And the first thing I'm going to say is one of the tenets of testing your work, testing your embroidery, and diagnosing problems in your designs is to say, okay, is it happening in the same place reliably? If it's happening in the same place reliably, we should take a look at a couple things. Everybody will say, oh, well, that's the file for sure. Not necessarily. If it's on a hat and it's happening over a seam, it could also be a seam. Or if it's on any garment that has an obstructive seam, that has something that might be causing some interference between, like I said, either in the hoop or the direction of the stitches are interfering poorly with that piece. There are things where there could be a feature of the garment that causes it, but I will say most of the time, if it's happening reliably in one place, in the design, one part of the design, one set of stitches, the same area of 10, 20, 100 stitches causes problems all the time, there's a good chance that's in your design, and it's something that you should look at in that case. So what we're going to go ahead and do is take a look at this particular design that we had. So we had a design that came in, and I'll just go ahead and show you just the numbers. I'm not going to show you the fill that was behind it. What you can imagine is there was a full panel of fill behind it that had some other elements in it, but I'm not going to show you that just because I don't want to show the person's design who brought this in, but we are going to show you the Killer 4. So let's go ahead and bring this back in. Here's our design that we're talking about, and here is the 3D foam and the Killer 4. Now, up at the top, at the peak, the apex of that 4, we were having issues. So first thing I'm going to do is just show you the 40 and say, all right, we can look at this. Right in here is where we were having our issues on this 4, right? We're having thread breakage. We're having issues in that particular place. It is consistently causing problems. So, yeah, and here, by the way, I hate to say this. I had to bring this in because it's funny. Mike Muldowney says, don't try and embroider around a button. Just saying. Yeah, if you do, have a really nice, clear path around it, and also understand how big your presser foot is, and that the back of the presser foot and the front of the presser foot and the sides of the presser foot are not equidistant from the needle. Ask me how I know and how some of my hoops don't look as good as they used to. When we need to actually get very close to a hoop to make something happen, go ahead and measure the distance from the needle to the back of your presser foot, to the front of your presser foot, and to both sides, and it'll help you develop a template. In fact, back before I was using software that had hoop templates that I could set up in a certain way like that, I actually did make my own graphical templates to show exactly how much space I had in hoops. So I was doing difficult work that had to be hooped very closely. I literally had, you'll see a circular template, and because generally on machines, we have more distance between the back of the presser foot and the front to the needle, that what you actually have inside of a round hoop is an oval of available space. Now, it's only slightly ovoid, but there's less space at the top of the hoop as you're looking at it, because why? We need to leave room for the back of the presser foot. So yeah, be careful getting around a button. Thank you, Mike, for that one. And it says, I'd like to see the video that prompted that response. Yes, indeed. Right. I'd like to see that in particular case. Right. So here, the case of the Killer 4, though. Let's get back to the Killer 4 and talk about it real quick. We don't have to look at that the whole time, but here's our 40. Here's the 4. Here's the problem we had. We're up at the vertex of this 4. Well, actually, the vertex would be down here, but this whole area, this junction, this joint, this corner is where we're having issues, right? So let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit more on it. And I think we can already tell what's going on. Any of you who have done 3D foam probably already know. Number one, I actually brought up to them, they were actually using a fairly loose density in the satin stitches. And what I asked them was, and I didn't hear back, but I asked them about the density in their satin stitches to cut that foam. And they were actually fairly happy with that density, and said it was, it seems like that was what was going on. It was right for them. So I told them, if you're getting good cutting at that density, go for it. But they're all the way down at 0.3. I think that's probably a little light for that. But at the same time, they've got 0.2 and lower densities up in their caps. And I actually tend to use a slightly lower density on my cap that's covered, because generally I'm not going to see as much of the foam once it goes up there. I'm not going to see that issue. By the way, I'm going to bring one more thing up because this is funny on this one. Mike says, I didn't catch that one on film. First and last time I tried that, I can imagine, because it's hard to keep a button centered where it should be. And this is absolutely the case if you haven't done it. There are a few things as nerve-wracking as the light thup, thup, thup when the presser foot is grazing a hoop. I would like to go ahead and submit for your consideration, audience. My weird noise that I like to say is when you have a long stitch that's doing a double cycle, I call it a ka-chunk. So much so that kind of became a thing, that ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk of an overly long stitch. I would like to submit the thup, thup, thup for the second weird onomatopoeic noise that came out of the Takeup. So thank you, Mike. Onomatopoeia, a word that stands for a noise like that. Thup, thup, thup is probably one of the most frightening things to hear. That little grazing when the back of that presser foot hits that hoop. Yeah, not fun. But let's go ahead and get back into the 4. We actually have some other questions as well. This is... Cindy says, on the 3D, was the underfill also under the 40? Way too many stitches to start with? To a degree. What I'm going to say is, when you're doing 3D foam work, you often have a border or something that's running right under the edge of this that's flat in the 2D foam, or in the 2D under the foam. Very frequent to have these kind of numbers on top of a border. I looked at their fills, and though they were a little heavy, I'd say, they weren't too bad. And like I said, they're using a lighter density to cut these satins. It's really not as heavy as I would go. I will often go 0.2 all the way down to 0.17 if I have to keep that foam cutting cleanly. Depends on the kind of foam I'm using. It's really crisp and tears easily and is really nice. High dense foams, sometimes you can go differently. And it looks to me like they're using colors that were very much matched. If you're using dark, like you got gray foam and gray thread, or you got black foam, especially on black and with black thread on top, you can get away with a lot. You can get away with a lot when you're talking about the density there, just because you're not going to see as much, and you hit it with the heat gun. As long as you don't have little furries, little edges coming out that look bad, and your satins are on the angles that you want them, you can make it better. You can make it work. It's not that bad. I will say it's pretty low density, and I don't think that was the issue. But here's the thing. You're right to say there's too many stitches, because here's what actually happened. They're using super dense, in my opinion, really dense caps. And we talk about caps and planks or bridges. I know Jeff calls them bridges. I call them planks. We're talking about where we're covering between, when we have a joint like this, I'll go ahead and zoom in and say we have a joint like this. This is a bridge or a plank. I do them differently, and you'll see one of my planks later. It covers up a joint between two satins so that you don't get any fall in when you cut the foam after the fact. You can sometimes get stitches fall in, or the foam wants to come apart. Well, you essentially sew the foam together before you get a cut. So here's the thing. We have kind of a dense cap, sure, but the actual issue is that they're using a 4 that essentially is not really made for 3D foam that much. And if you look at this, we've got 0.3 density on this, 0.3 here, 0.2 in the cap, we have another bit of underlay here that is actually being used for a plank or a bridge. And if you look at it all together, when you zoom through this thing, watch this, you'll see that when it runs, we have, right, as we get into the 4, as soon as it actually gets to that stitching, okay, it looks like it popped out here. Let me pop that back out. As we get up to the 4 in the zoom here, all right, it's right toward the end. Okay, it's coming up funky. Let me take a look at this. Well, what we can do essentially here is we'll see that we've got something going on with this file. This is the original file they sent me, and it may not work quite properly here. I don't know what's going on with it. But let me go ahead and take a look at it one more time. You can still see we've got this piece underneath, because if we're going into the 3D, you can see that this piece here is underneath, that this is going underneath this piece. We can see that we have the cap that's up here that's for both sides essentially, but we've got one stroke at that heavy foam cutting density. We've got a cap that's more dense than that. We have this that's more dense, and we have a plank here that really, because the stitches are all running the same direction, I don't really think we needed a plank, and the plank's not going to do much, because if you look at it, it's running the same direction as all the stitches on top. When we have this kind of junction like this side-to-side junction, we're not going to need a real plank right here. I don't think that has any problem with that. And so what I would say is you look at this, and we have got massive amounts of density. If you look right here, we've got a junction of 3 layers of full density for cutting foam. 3 layers of that with a 4th layer of the plank. So up in this corner, in this area right here, we have a tremendous amount of density going on. This area right here, because each one of those is already close to double density compared to, like, this is 40 weight thread, we're getting close to double density. We might have like 6x density right here. On top, because it's also on top of a fully dense fill around the edges, because that's where we're having that other angle. We're having the rest of that stuff on the edges. We have the 2D version of the filled area. I'm trying to tell you what it is. We have the 2D version underneath it, and then we have this 3D foam on top of 3D foam, on top of the cap, on top of a plank. So we're ending up with a tremendous amount of density up in this corner, and I'll tell you why they did it, and there's really it's not a bad reason why they did it. They're trying to do is maintain the look. If you look at the look of this corner here, they wanted a lapped corner, right? An overlapped corner where we have this nice seam up this central piece. And we've got lapped corners almost everywhere else. That's what we're using for most of this design. So most of the letters are going to have this lapped corner. And so they're thinking, okay, if I maintain that lapped corner, if I use this style of lettering, and this may or may not have been done originally for foam, and it had foam underlay added to it and foam caps and elements, then they're really kind of making a stylistic choice. They're saying, all right, well, I've got this going on here. What I would wager, though, is I'd say, okay, if we're having that much density, we really don't want to have 2 different columns meeting up over the cap, because we know the cap is going to be there. The problem is we have a seam where we're running. We have to remember also 3-dimensional density. We have the needles actually going through, so we have the density of the thread going through the cap and everything else. It's not just that the density is packing together this direction. We're talking about the density of needles going through, stitches going through and around each other. And when we're talking about that, we have this seam going right through the middle of this and creating this tremendous amount of density. So not only do we have the density of things stacking on top of each other, we have this 3-dimensional density of the seam right there. What we're going to have to do is do something to lighten that up. Also, I would say that a lot of these planks that are in here are actually pretty heavy, and having this fully underlayed plank here, because as you can see, it actually has an edge run and a zigzag underlay under the plank, as well as some manual work and this incredibly heavy. And like I said, maybe not incredibly heavy. It is fairly dense, though. You have a really dense cap, considering if you like the density for this to cut, if you're okay with the density of this satin stitch to cut these sides, then you don't need more density than that to cut the cap. So the cap doesn't need to be quite that dense to make that happen. You wouldn't need that density to hit this. If you got this as the density here, then that should be at least no more than that density should be in that cap here. I wouldn't see why you would. And certainly I actually tend to use a little less density on the caps than I do on the actual rest of the design there, because usually that's covered up by the top stitching. The edge of the cap can be a little rougher perhaps than the rest of it. Not everybody agrees with that, but as you guys know with me, I practice what I call stitch consciousness. I use every stitch I need and no stitch that I don't whenever possible. And so you'll see that I try not to add a lot of excess density here. And the other thing I also noticed, which they didn't say they had any trouble with, is they didn't have a lot of reveal here for the underlying cap. So I think they're probably having some waterfall happening on the top and bottom, but I don't know. They didn't complain of any waterfall. What I call waterfall is when you have a cap and then stitches from the satin start to fall off the edge and roll off of that. I try and stop my stitches right at that edge of the cap, but some people, a little bit sometimes will fall off, but if you have the full fall, that waterfall action is where we get all those stitches coming off the edge. But in any case, what I would say though is definitely what we have here is just an overmuch of density. A couple of reasons why that can happen. Certainly you can have the other issue with the excess density. As you can see here, this is pretty balanced, but you can get excess density inside of tight corners. Definitely, that's one of the things that happens is the inside of a corner like this or the inside of a curve versus the outside of a curve. It's much more distance that you're covering with the same number of stitches on the outside of a curve than on the inside. And since we don't always like the texture, especially on light colors, you don't always want the texture of short stitching in here. People will use full coverage, no short stitching on foam pretty frequently. And they'll end up with a lot of density building up. You'll have like densities that are triple and more inside of these inner corners. Luckily, that's not happening here. It looks like it's pretty balanced with the angles. It doesn't look bad. But over here, we certainly are seeing we've got the full density of the cap, the full density of the underlying stroke that's coming in here from the left, the full density of this coming up on the top, and potentially some issues with this seam. So what did I recommend for this? And this is something I actually have used in several items. I just went ahead and said, yes, it's nice to have this texture. We would love to keep this seam if we could. That's something we can do, and there may be some other ways to fake it. But that seam is not worth the amount of trouble you're having on the cap, and especially dark charcoal gray on dark subdued colors. The likelihood is you're not going to see that texture as much. It's not worth the trouble you're having with breakage and issues. And so when I dumped in my version of it, I went with a pretty long stitch. Now, are we going to have some slow stitches here? Yes, we are. I mean, we're dealing with foam, and these are pretty long as well. Yes, we're going to have some slow stitches here. We can also work on that depending on how much you care about the texture that's in this cap. There's things we can do. But what I did was, until I get out well beyond the excess density of the cap, and as you can see, I've got a lighter density that they did in the cap here. Until we get out beyond that cap, I'm going to use one solid satin stitch. I'm going to break this out and have my own cap done in a separate satin. So definitely that's what I'm thinking about. I'm having that instead of turning that corner. I'm going to go ahead and work on it that way. And so certainly for me, my attitude was this. I went ahead and bridged this gap because maybe they're using a really crispy foam, and I've seen some really crispy high density foams break apart where even this kind of junction they don't like. So I said, all right, rather than change everything about your design, I'll go ahead and put a light plank here. And by the way, I already do see this, right? Jeff says, every time I hear you say plank, I think pirate. Maybe that's why you call them bridges. Honestly, I have no problem with that. Pirates work for me. So arg, matey, there you go. You got me to say it. You can tell everybody you won. But yeah, because of that, I went ahead and used a plank here. And I also put together a plank for this because honestly, at the top here, yes, I have this plank here, certainly, but I also have this plank here. I went ahead and put a plank in because sometimes, especially on this wide satin here, it does split. So that's what we do there. And then let's go ahead and see this here too. Going back to the full upright seam on 4, why not cut the excess underlay since it matches the seam light? Using the bridge to keep them together, you certainly can. Looking at the way that it was coming together, though, cutting the excess underlay on that, you certainly could get the excess underlay, and the underlay pulled it out, but it didn't pull out enough. And for me, I thought the safest bet was probably to do this because they were having breakage all the way down the seam. So you could certainly do that. You could certainly cut out some of that excess underlay. The problem is we're still going to have to cut at the top. And if you get really short, because the problem is if you go back to the original, and we can go ahead and look at that. In my opinion, at least, I've got both of these here. I've got the seams here. I've got to do something to cut this. And I don't have a place where I can stop this other column coming up before it gets all the way up to the end. So I'm still going to have double density here no matter what. So if I stop this underlay until I get up to here, maybe I could cut that apart, maybe hold it together with a plank, but we're going to end up with texture because no matter what I do, even if I shorten this up, you can see I've got this whole column here too. So I've got in here, I'm having double density no matter what, unless I cap it. I'm having double density no matter what. And if I don't have a cap underneath it, and I'm not talking about the capping of the satin, but if I don't have this cutting cap underneath it, I'm going to have a little section here that wants to poke out, that wants to have some issues with the foam still remaining after we pull it. Because I'm still going to end up with 3x density right here, no matter what. So yes, can we try and match seam line? Sure. We're going to end up with 3x density right here if I don't have something to cut it. It's still going to end up loose because, like I said, I could cut off some portion of this cutting cap and then I would have some issues with that, right? I would have some issues going on with that, certainly. Like I said, can you do that? Sure. I think you could probably do that. The bridge would keep them together up here. But when we have this part here, I think you're still going to have, if you want to maintain this full seam, we're going to have excess density in this corner no matter what, just because we have this coming under, this on the top, and we don't want these to come apart. We don't want them to meet right here and have a tiny, I don't know. Personally, I don't like to have like a small tapered piece underneath this because I think you get too much texture on the top stitching. Up to you. Plank might help that, or bridge might help that, but it just depends on how you look at it. I personally, for the finish, when I've done this before, I usually will go with a cap partially up the way because I don't think it's all that visible, especially in this colorway. But yeah, there's more than one way to do it, and you can certainly try it. I just think you're still going to end up where you have the little piece here where there's this satin, which is this stroke here. We have a little piece here that is this satin that goes all the way up to the end, and then we have this here. So if we want to maintain that look, we're going to end up with triple density up toward the edge right here, almost no matter what. Now, it's not a huge piece. Might be able to get away with it. Might be able to cut it some other way, but we're not going to get the cap to extend all the way out without having that triple density. For me, safest way to do it for production to make sure that I'm not going to get extra foam coming out or the density breaking stuff down was to use a full width cap on the satins. Up to you, though. Something to try. And honestly, I would love to see more people try more versions. Honestly, all the cornering I've done has been in response to how it works on the machine. So I definitely won't naysay it. So that's certainly a portion I could do there. Let's see here. So anyway, we'll take a look at this now. The final piece that I actually did for it, take a look here again. Like I said, not the only way you can do it, but what you can see in this is at no time do I have more than one small area where we've got double density in here. That's all I have, one small overlap. I maintained it so we could still get some of the flavor of that seam. Went ahead and I didn't want to have a giant piece right here. Didn't want to have a huge span that goes all the way from left to right here. So I went ahead and did this way. In fact, the other way I thought about doing this, while we're talking about this, I thought about doing it the way that I've done it here, except using a custom split. Now, the person who was doing this didn't have custom splitting in their software. And what I mean by a custom split is where I could use a pattern stitch, a pattern cut to, as this is going across, drop stitch points on every stitch or every other stitch along this line as if it were cut. If you wanted to maintain the texture but didn't want the cut or the density, I think you could get away with that. And especially if you're using, like, Embroidery has the ability that on the return stitch to not do the pattern and only do the pattern on every other stitch. You could definitely put a line there to get the style of the line going up from here on that satin. And I think that's still something you could do, but the person who is using this, they didn't have that as an add-on to their software, so I showed them this without that. There is a potential where we could try and bring back the look of this line and still not do the excess density, but for me, this was the answer that I thought was probably the most friendly. But yeah, I like that idea a lot, and I want to test it. I didn't have a time to test it, so it's one of those things where if I don't have time to test it myself and it's something that I haven't loved on a previous piece, I will wait and tell somebody, yeah, I might want to do it, but I'm sure. But yeah, oh, like a false seam. And I think in this particular case, especially in this colorway, I think it would work, and I think it's interesting. So the idea of a false seam here, I think it's a great idea. I think it's something I would love to look into later, because that would not be production unfriendly. And in this particular piece, this is also, remember, production friendly in the sense that it also is just fewer stitches in general than doing the two satins that are there. This is certainly still gets the flavor of it. We have a little bit of overlap here, but at no point do I have the full density cutting cap underneath two full density satins. So like, again, not the only option for this. Absolutely not the only option for this. You could have done a million different things to kind of bring these together. I think that there's 2 or 3 different options I've looked at, but this one is the one that I know is immediately the known safe option that will run well and won't cause excess density to pop up there. But like I said, what you're going to see is that I have a tendency to do manual bridges rather than, like here, the bridges are done with a regular satin, and this one isn't even feathered. So you do have like perforation along a line. Is it enough to cause issues on the foam? Probably not. I have used some very soft foams in my time, and so you'll see that some of the things I do, and I would say some of the styles I do are probably less concern now, because you don't get as much crushing with a little bit of stitching down the middle. Like this has some traveling down the centers, whereas on most of my designs, I would travel with a long zigzag across just inside the edge just to get that done. So it's one of those things too. So, you know, depends on that for me. And that's what I generally say, is that I will often only use like zigzags across. And I think part of that is my history of using very soft foam where I didn't want to crush the center and get a divot, because I've had foam so soft that if I ran my central travel stitches right up the middle, you could see in my top stitching, and I'm kind of showing you a satin stitch from the end, and you would see it have a little divot where the foam had crushed into the center. From me running too much stuff up and down the center, the foam itself had a crush in the center, and you could see a little shadow, a little dip in the top of my crown of my satin stitch. So that's why I have a tendency to run big zigzags across everything manually. But you can also see I don't run all my density at once across one direction. I tend to run out and back, and it lets me kind of travel back and forth, and I get free travel, if you want to call it that, without building up excess density, as I would if I had to go one direction and then travel back with a straight stitch or some other stitch. So I use this kind of zigzag plank or bridge to stop this popping up. And I'll say when we have a flat seam like this, where you have a butt joint where two satins come together like this, you don't always see foam popping up, but depending on where it is on the cap, on the curvature, on the density of the foam itself, it can pop up in between. You'll see a little piece of foam that wants to pop up in that butt joint seam unless you overlap, and overlapping will often make a small crush in the foam right where the overlap is. So I don't try and overlap very deeply either. But that's one of the things that I will sometimes do here, is to put a little plank there. And then you'll see that I've gone ahead and left the full width cutting cap. I think personally, if I'm looking at this again, I would pull this back just a little bit from this corner. I think this is too tight to the corner. It's probably going to show a little bit of the stitching here because we need a little bit of push compensation here. We need to pull it back from that end. But this is going to definitely not have the kind of density. If you look at the kind of densities that we had here, and I don't know if I can pull the density map. Now, these are all going to be heavy densities. It's actually showing some of the background, so I'll pull that back out. But that shows you that some of the densities are pretty high in there. Even here, it's going to be high densities, but less. You'll see the red that's in there in that heat map. Pull that back out, and then you'll see over here how much more red there is in that piece. So that's why I don't want those overlaps. We're talking about some really heavy densities, and that's one way to pull it back. So that's the second case. It puts us out at bonus time. So I'm probably not going to talk too much about the other subjects that we had on today, but that's what we talked about. I wanted to get into that 3D foam a little bit and say, this is really what happened here. We had excess density because we're trying to maintain a style here. And I'd like to pull back and talk briefly about some stuff that I saw in the comments here. And then maybe we'll do a little bit of bonus time and cover some of the other topics I wanted to cover as far as most asked questions, and see if I can get you guys to bring that stuff back in. But David says, density maps, ES4 have that? No, that density map is an Embrilliance only thing, but it's available all the way down to, lower softwares that you don't have to have the Digitizing Stitch Artist to get that. So that's an Embrilliance thing. Check that out. That's a Density Repair Kit has that, and it's really awesome to take a look at. It's an Embrilliance thing. So yeah, I don't usually talk specific tools. I like to talk so everybody can use whatever tools they have, but that one's specific to Embrilliance, and being from the Embrilliance Studios, I'm pretty proud of what Brian did on that piece. That's one of my favorite pieces that they've done. So we'll talk about a few different things. Jeff says, how do you recommend turning a corner without getting too much stitches on the interior? That is really about a balance of angles. A lot of people like to come in on really sharp 90-degree angles, and they make the turn very quickly. I make the turns more slowly, and it's about slowly transitioning in so that you don't either have really loose stitches or you don't have that super tight corner where we have too much going in the center. Also, I will use some short stitches on the inside edges of corners on 3D foam. Unless I'm on like white, yellow, gold, where that texture is really annoying, I will use short stitches there pretty frequently. In really dark colors, I will let some short stitches happen there. And if I don't have short stitches, then I will just really work on my transition, where I try and stay perpendicular to the column edges as much as I can in my satin stitch angles, because that gives you nice tight stitches. But as I get up into a tight corner, I'm going to very gradually loosen my way out. And that's something you'll actually see in that 3D foam article that I have up. And I believe I've got here, if I can bring that to you guys, there is a piece that I did for Madeira USA that people often call on. I'm going to go ahead and throw that in the comments here, and I can go ahead and show you guys. There's a video that I did for Madeira USA that a lot of people like to refer to, and there's actually the slides for it are available, so you can have those downloaded. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in the comments as well. There's a PDF of those slides, and some of those things are showed in here. I believe I've got some cornering in here, and you can see the densities here like I talked about. I believe there's some cornering mentioned, and if not, I can bring that up again, and you'll actually see that. You'll see the cornering in the previous Takeup episode that we did where we talked about 3D foam as well, where we talk about those loose corners. And I've also done a piece here for Mr. X Stitch, talks about it a little bit, not nearly as much, but we do have some balanced stitch angle discussion here as well. We talk about our planks and caps. It's R Matey. We can joke about my planks again. But yeah, here's that as well, the Mr. X Stitch one. And that one is more from a craft angle a little bit, a craft fiber arts angle, but it does talk about the different corners and does discuss it a little bit. Certainly go back to that previous episode of the Takeup. I would love for you guys to check that one out, because that particular episode, that is episode 3, actually goes into a little bit more about the cornering, and it's something that I teach in my seminars. So definitely we'll talk about that, but that's something good to discuss. Certainly we have those different ones we can look at though, and you can see some of these other issues about how I use planks, how I use caps, how I use points. And, you know, also I'll say sometimes I will turn a corner, even on something you wouldn't think about turning a corner. This cap is kind of not working on green screen, but I'll go ahead and bring myself up again full screen. You can see it. This corner up here is actually turned. That is a turned corner. I actually turned through that instead of overlapping those. And because we're on that dark navy, I put some short stitching in it. Not a lot, but there is short stitching in it. Dark navy, it's not very noticeable. Just the same way with straight stitches when we're talking about like black work and red work. Straight stitches look great and solid in dark colors on light backgrounds. Light colors on dark backgrounds, especially because of the sheen, tends to look really broken and stitchy. So on light colors, you have to really work on your angles and balance them. On dark colors, short stitches. I actually will use some short stitching and allow it to drop some of that out. High density foam, short stitches, and careful angle control. So that's one of those things. So that's how we have that. Also, let's see, we had a couple other questions. Heat gun versus lighters came up here, and I'm with Mike on this one. I use the heat gun. Now, he said because his wife is still on the lighters, but if it's not white thread or a white hat, lighter is fine. You can't reach the gun. I have flame polished many a design, so I'm not going to say I've never done it. I prefer the heat gun, controllable heat gun. Cheap heat guns that are too hot and don't have controls on them, sometimes you will burn and scorch, especially on white thread, especially on white hats, white garments. Be careful. The white shows the scorching very easily. You got to be really careful with that stuff. And like I said, I'm with Mike. Prefer the heat gun, safer overall for the product and my fingers. What I will also say though, if any of you are in a hybrid shop that does screen printing, be very careful trying to use the conveyor dryer. I had some guys who thought this would be a much easier way to handle things by throwing them through the dryer, and the hats were too high for the dryer and came out literally burned. Be careful jamming tall stuff through your dryer. Didn't work for us, might work for you, but I certainly won't say that it's something I recommended. Heat gun is how I like to do that stuff. So heat gun is my way to do that stuff. So I'll say, you know, that's what I would say. Gradual corners are a thing. And thank you, Mike. I love that you say that. The Madeira foam webinar has become some of a Bible for me. So much good info in there. Thank you very much. Love that. I appreciate it. Gradual angles make corners on foam, can make or break the run. Yeah, absolutely. Gradual angles really do help quite a bit. And Jeff, absolutely perfect, man. I got a heat gun that I can set the temp on, put it on 320, and so I know it won't melt things. Sounds like we're baking. Hey, we're pirates, we're baking. We're all over the place here. And I know some people are bakers here. I saw Jerry Lee was up here earlier. I know she bakes. She knows some stuff. She's a professional cake decorator. I'm sure she did some baking too. Knows more than I know. And David, the Madeira webinar it's a saved video on YouTube. I have that posted up earlier. But I'll try and reply to your comment later with it. But it is posted in the comments earlier, and you can find it. That's the funny thing about having my name be Erich Campbell with that H on it, E-R-I-C-H Campbell. Not too many of us. And if you look Erich Campbell Embroidery or Erich Campbell on YouTube, you'll find this channel where I am now, and you'll probably find all my Madeira webinars as well. Do tell the people from Madeira if you want more content from me. They've been doing some stuff with their own content. I love doing the webinars with them, but you want to hear some more stuff from me with the Madeira folks, I'd love to do some more work with them. In fact, I've got some calls that we may be doing some more stuff later, but that's some sampling and may not be full-on webinars like we used to do. I did some really great stuff with Rich Medcraft, the Stitchwise, great digitizer himself as well, so pretty good stuff there too. And Jeff says, that was my 3D puff education for a long time before I started learning from other places. Hey, man, tell me if you got some new tips from other places so I can update my next webinar. Yeah, I've done some stuff since then. And I am going to say this too, guys. I often recommend to go with satin stitches. And you'll hear me say, don't use fills for foam. Yes, you can use fills on foam. In fact, I brought something to talk about that briefly. This is one of my own pieces that actually has a pretty big, it's got a pretty good slab of foam underneath everything. And yes, I mean, I've got some green screen issues happening, but the woman who's on here with the basket on her head, we got a big filled piece there with foam underneath it. Can you use fills on foam? Yes. What I have found is that some people didn't like the texture back in the day. Now that more people are doing fills and treatments over foam, it's become acceptable. Previously, I found, especially with the soft foams, that the fills would crush them down. Remember that a lot of my teaching may have started before we had high density foam. So now with high density foams, especially the very high density hard foams, you can get a lot more out of them. And most certainly, it depends on if you're a customer or you, if you're making something for yourself, if you like that texture. I used to do split satin on foams and auto splits on foams, and not everybody liked that. I really like the look of an auto split on foam. I like the extra texture that's there. It's kind of interesting. It's something that was fun to play with, at least. I liked playing with it. It wasn't great for all my customers, and it turns out that a lot of them didn't really like that. So Jeff says, next puff webinar, large fills on foam. Yeah, maybe. I'll say this, a lot of the people I used to do fill on foam are using a tremendous amount of stitching to get it done. And I want to find a way that's a little more conscious of stitching for the foam. I want to find a way that's going to work better and get me a texture that I like. And so far, it hasn't been the best ever. It's not my favorite. So, it's one thing where, yes, you can do fill on foam. I find that even if I'm looking at this piece here that does have fills over foam, and these really are not very strange fills. These fills are very kind of garden variety fills. When you look at the arm here, the arm is so much taller than the fill that's next to it that sometimes it still isn't my favorite because the fills does crush down better. It does crush down quite a bit. So, that's how it usually works. And Mike says, I've just been dabbling in fill over foam. It's impactful treatment for the customers wanting extra punch. Yeah, like I said, it has now become more viable. And I'll say definitely with high density foams, definitely if you're carefully using it, it is interesting. But for me, not my best, right? Not my best use of fill over foam. Not loving it the most. It is something you can do. I have done it. Obviously, I've got pieces where I do it, but I had a lot of customers that didn't love it. And so most of the time I would try and restrict to as much satin work as I could. And like I said, more stuff going on now that's interesting. And if you look at, I've talked about Joseph DeJoris before, don't know if I'm saying his name correctly. He's out there doing a lot of layered satins on foam as well as that stuff. And that stuff is really interesting. And another thing I've seen that's very interesting to me that I've played with a little bit is applique over foam, so that I can get a big slab of 3D material and put a satin edge on it over foam with an applique in the middle. That's pretty interesting too. It's some stuff that still needs some work, but there are some interesting things going on with that. And David says, and by the way, I've done this before. I've been tearing apart a Nix puff cap, and I swear they're using auto split for a fill border around a satin logo. Yeah. Could possibly be. People have been using things like that. I've seen auto split on them. It gets some texture on it, but there's nothing that's all that terrible about it. I think it's interesting. It just, once again, the end result is what we're looking for. If your customer is happy with the texture you're getting out of fill over foam is totally possible. It is going to have a slightly lower crown than satin on the same foam. That's what I've found so far. You're not going to see quite as high a crown on it. So definitely a very cool thing to look at. So try it out. By all means, try it out. Also, what you'll find is you can compensate. Use more foam to get a lower crown than you might have gotten with satin. It's all about this holistic approach, folks. So no matter who tells you, whether it's me, whether it's Vitor who's doing that fill over foam stuff a lot, no matter who it is who tells you how to do something, remember, it's all coming together from the same physical reality of what thread can do, what the machine can do, and what result we're trying to get. If your result is I want the highest possible crown height of the foam off the cap, and I want a nice smooth finish, satins are going to be the best way to get height and smoothness. If you want a big filled area and you just want it to stick over the cap and you're willing to use more foam to get a higher crown, fill over foam totally works for that. It's all about getting the texture you want and using the materials that make it possible, and also making it production friendly. Back in the day, I also found that I had some issues with production friendliness, spoilage rates, stuff like that, using the soft foam, and I didn't love doing that. Also, too much texture in the fill itself. The fill would be a little ripply over foam pretty frequently. Once again, not as much, I think, over the high-density foams that are current now, more over the old-school puffy foam that we might have started out with. I've got quite an old piece in front of me here, if I can bring it up. And this piece, this foam here, I love this piece. I love this. It goes right over the mesh. It's one of my favorite pieces that I show because I really like kind of the look of it. Super classic, trucker hat, mesh back, outlined with 2D. But what you're definitely going to see here, this foam, it is super squishy. It's not real high. It doesn't have the crown that the super high density stuff has now. And when you push on it, you can still compress it quite a lot. You can squish it between your fingers and it is absolutely soft. The kind of foams we were using when I made this are not the kind of foams you're getting today. So briefly, guys, we're 15 minutes out. I don't want to go into super bonus time. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm literally going to list off some of the most frequently asked questions. This may be a part 2 that we come back to later, though I have some really interesting stuff, and we'll have to see what you guys think about these ones that I want to do. But let's talk about this first. Let's say these were the most asked questions I have, and I have an article here, and I'll go ahead and post this in. At the time, couple years back, these were some of my most asked questions from digitizers and from embroiderers. Because you guys remember, I do a lot of embroidery business, e-commerce, other stuff too. So that link that I just posted in, that was this piece that I'm talking about, age-old questions. And these were the most asked questions that I had at the time. Number one, it was about which software do you use? Now, I'm not going to go too far into it, but just to say, as you know, I thoroughly believe that though tools are different, you can make a masterpiece with any tool that has the most basic stuff and it works correctly with the most basic stuff. If you have a fill, a satin stitch, and a straight stitch and a manual, which, both together, you can do just about anything you've ever seen in embroidery. Just depends on the speed you can get it done. So there are more tools that make things faster, better, that make it easier to do artistic treatments. And there's all kinds of stuff beyond that. But I think your tools are nowhere near as important as your understanding of embroidery, your creativity, and your willingness to work on seeing embroidery as it is and understanding that holistic nature of the interaction between garment, materials, thread, machine, and design. If you can get those things together, you understand how they come together and how they act on each other, you can come at different angles to make things happen. So software is one of those things. How important good digitizing is. Because people always want to know, can I get cheaper digitizing or can I do it all myself? And I would say, you want to learn to do it yourself? Awesome. I'd love to have more digitizers in the world, but getting the best digitizing is still important because good digitizing makes you competent. Great digitizing makes you more production friendly, reduces times things are on machines, differentiates your product from other people's product because of the creativity and the artistic nature of the thing. And overall means less waste, less time wasted, less spoilage, stuff like that. So good digitizing, how important is digitizing? And I said very important. And honestly, when you're thinking about things in a longer time scale than the single order, it becomes even more important if you have a repeat order or someone who's going to be using a logo over and over with you with years. It's also about the relationship we have with that customer and the experience they have. So how important is that? The other question, how do I deal with somebody who's cheaper than I am? And it's something that I talked about very recently, had a show about providing value, about adding value to your garment, and what value is, value to your product. Go back to that Takeup and watch it again. The best thing you can do is to find out what is your factor that makes you different and buy into it and make it real and find the customers for that. There's always going to be somebody who's a bargain shopper and cheaper. I'm not saying you never do a special in your entire life. I'm not saying you don't just hunt for some generic people who are looking to get decorated apparel. But if you have a specialty, lean hard into that specialty. Find your tribe and the people who are willing to pay for you, because the people who keep on lowballing price will eventually be out of business. The classic thing, the nice way that I say it is, know your value and charge appropriately and find your tribe. The worst way I said it is when people would come to me and say, the guy down the street can do it cheaper. I'd say, oh, by all means, if you can do it cheaply, go ahead and have it done by him. If you like the quality that you get in 6 months, when his business isn't operating because he's not making enough capital to keep himself alive, come back to the shop and I'll help you out. That's the mean Erich way of saying that. That's the 5 p.m. somebody runs in the door way of saying that one. But the truth of the matter is, you have to know your value and get paid enough to stay alive and do what you want to do. And one of the best ways we can do that is to understand that we can bring unique value from different angles too. It's not just better embroidery, better digitizing. It's also what experience the customer has with us and what we can offer them there. And then the last one was, how do I handle larger orders than I can take? And the first thing I'll say is find a reliable partner for outsourcing. Everybody says, I'm going to go ahead and ramp up, buy more machines, or people want to do that, especially those of us who really love embroidery and want to play. We want more hardware. We want different hardware that can do different treatments than we're used to. We want to bring more things in so we can do the work ourselves. Doesn't always make sense. Sometimes the best way is to broker it. So those were my most asked questions at the time. And I'm actually doing a new series with Images Magazine in the UK talking about some of the current most asked questions. And these are actually some simple questions because we're doing some digitizing stuff. We certainly have making and attaching patches. You guys know I've done like 3 pieces on this. I've done a piece that I did for Marshall Atkinson that we talked about patch styles, and I covered some of that last week. But also we did patch attachment. Patches are still going strong. It's years since I talked about people who asked me, how do I do the patch trend? The patch trend is now years and years old. We're getting up toward like 6 to 8 years of patches being pretty hot, patches and pins. So I'm definitely not going to say patch trend anymore, but we're going to see more of that coming up. Screen versus stitch, more and more questions from people coming in from the graphic design side of the world who don't kind of get that the embroidery machine is not a thread printer. What's on screen is not what we end up with in our embroidery. And so I'm going to be talking about that in Images Magazine soon. And certainly we're going to have how do I sell embroidery online? We've talked about that a little bit in the Takeup as well, and I'll be talking about it more here and there. And Another perennial favorite always is fonts and text, and I will be doing some more issues on fonts and text. Now, certainly great stuff there. And by the way, I love Jeremy coming in on this one here. I love some patches. Yes, patches I love. And I talked last week, if you didn't get to see it last week, talked all about different styles of patches on top of embroidery and as hybrids with embroidery. Cool stuff there. I love patches as well. I love patches and emblems. I may actually come up to do some design topics about that as well, because I've done some whole cloth designing myself. I won't call myself a graphic artist by any means, but I will say I've done some design work after over many years of being in this world. I've designed some patches for customers, certainly quite a few, and some patches for myself. So we might talk about that as well. But that's something interesting we can discuss as far as those most asked questions. But here are the couple things I'm thinking about. And I'd love to see if you guys like this. Now, I didn't get to do enough about ambigrams before, and that might be a part 2 at some point. Some people said they wanted that. I know I've got some questions about people doing, I would like to have you. I agree with Jeff, by the way. I'd love to have photos of the patch collection. Absolutely, your patch collection would be awesome to see more of. But here's the stuff I talked about. So ambigrams, people liked it. It was fun. I've had a lot of comments since then that they would like me to cover that again and maybe talk about it some more. We can do that some other time. But I have another thing that is particular to me that is a style I work in. And you guys may know that I was once a medievalist. I was studying kind of pre-Christian Scandinavia was really what I'll call that. But it was Scandinavia, and it was also other Germanic cultures. So we're talking about like Anglo-Saxon England. It was stuff that I studied quite a bit and studied language in that. Went to Iceland, spent some time out there. But in that, I really became a lover of what I'll call, is not really a great term for it, but like Germanic design or Viking Age design, design from different periods coming out of Scandinavia, out of Anglo-Saxon England, out of Frankish peoples, out of Germany of a certain period, as you would call it. It wasn't Germany as we know it now. I've become a fan of those things, and I do designs both from traditional sources and based on that style, that I do original design work both in embroidery and graphic design. I think that I would love to do a piece on that. So I think that may come up soon here as we come up into this next week, maybe a little bit further than that. I don't know, it'll be next week. It might be the week after that. I think I'm going to do some Viking Age embroidery stuff and talk about those designs and maybe give you some definitions and stuff, very much like we did with typography and jargon. We'll talk a little bit about Viking Age design, about Germanic design and what it's like, just some real basic terminology. And then I'll show you some of my pieces and the things that I bring into consideration when doing that kind of work. And that also includes, it does kind of spill over into what most people would consider Celtic work. Now, this is a modern version of it, but you guys have seen all in green. Sorry, kids. Green screen says no. I've got some Celtic not work pieces that people like, certainly, but I would like to do some Viking Age design stuff. If you like that idea and you want to hear more about that, let me know. If it's a total bomb and you don't want to hear about it, I will definitely cut it out. But I think every once in a while, in with these technical pieces that you might want to hear some fun stuff about a design style you don't know, and then see some of my pieces, and I will tear apart my embroidery so you can see what I was doing and why. I think that's a fun topic, so I think that's something I'm going to cover here shortly. But there's definitely some other topics like that I want to cover where I'd like to talk a little bit about the design style I'm talking about, and then say, hey, now that we're in embroidery, here are the things in the embroidery I use to make that design style happen. And so I want to get over that. And also, like I said, guys, you've seen that I've had Jeremy Picker here, and there's another contributor who's not here that I would love to bring in, and we will talk about that later. Soon, we'll also be talking about some retail style stuff coming up in the next month or so. It's going to be a special event that I will talk about more. We're going to gather some more comments from you guys about it and have your information come in so you can join in this special event. We're going to talk about some applications, some retail styles, some cool stuff with some people who really know what they're doing on this scale. So if you've ever done retail research like I've had and want to see what the big design houses do or what the big clothing brands do and what that looks like and what the kind of considerations are, that's something that's coming up too soon. So that would be really cool. And Jeff says, we need to get you a fuchsia screen, might take care of the green screen problems. I really like green, and I do too many green designs. The other thing I can do is just show you guys the actual natural screen back here at some point. I bet the original couple episodes, you guys will know, didn't have the green screen. They just had the big red wall that's behind me, and I can show you some stuff. I think the other thing I need to do is get a second camera hooked up. If I can do a second camera, a second share, I can actually show you guys on a second camera, because eventually at some point I want to do some stuff on machines. You guys may know, you see the ZSKs behind me. I actually have in-house now, I've got a ZSK single head that I'm going to be doing projects on very soon. So there is a possibility that we're going to do some live embroidery at some point. There's certainly more work that will sometime be done with some live digitizing. It's something that's a little dicey. I don't always love to do the live digitizing stuff, but I have done it before, and it's something that I might do because we want to talk about some motifs, some old school techniques, how to draw certain shapes and do certain stitch styles. I know when I talked last week about emblems, people were excited about things like the little tiny stars that I was talking about, little tiny star fields, how to handle really small detailed designs and what I would do while I was working on it. Some of that stuff may become live digitizing at some point, but that might not be a take-up thing. That might be a different thing, but we'll talk about it later. In any case, for now, that is definitely more than bonus time. I'm going to go ahead and head out on this episode of the Take Up. I would recommend anybody who wants to talk about stuff that you have in your particular designs, you have some issues with your designs, definitely hit me up here or on social media, anywhere you find that Erich, Erich Campbell. You can hit me up and send me a message. So I think that'd be a really cool thing. You send me some questions that you want to have answered. Send me things you think are interesting. If you like the idea of the Viking art, hit me up and tell me what you think about that. And we will definitely talk about more. I love doing these cases, especially if it's something you don't mind hashing out with everybody. Show me some designs, show me some stuff like that. I can't get to everybody, but if I do get to you, you might end up on one of these case files. Anyway, with that, guys, super happy to have had you all here. It's been a great Friday, and I cannot wait to do it again. Have a wonderful weekend. I'm also going to say happy anniversary to my wife. Our marriage anniversary, our wedding anniversary is tomorrow, and so I want to say thank you, honey, for all of your support. You have always been there for me, and everything you do means more than you can know. So happy anniversary to my wife, Celeste, and thank all of you. You people mean a lot to me too. All of my embroiderers, all of my stitchers. Stay strong, stitch on, and I cannot wait to see you again next Friday.